In 1976, Eleanor Manica, an art historian and archaeologist studying Khmer architecture, had been systematically documenting the temple's dimensions for months, measuring walls, galleries, towers, and courtyards with the kind of obsessive precision. But Manica had noticed something that nagged at her, a pattern in the measurements that seemed too consistent to be accidental. The causeway measured 349.203 meters from the outer gate to the temple's western entrance. The number meant nothing by itself, but when she divided it by 4, the result was 87.3 meters, a figure that matched almost exactly the number of days in 3 lunar months. She returned to her measurements of the temple's other dimensions, looking for similar patterns. The central tower stood 65 meters above the ground level, and when she calculated ratios between different architectural elements, astronomical numbers kept appearing. The distance from the western entrance to the central tower, when measured in specific units the Khmer had used called hat, corresponded to the number of days in the solar year. The axial dimensions of the temple complex, when analyzed in relation to each other, encoded the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle during which Earth's rotational axis traces a slow circle against the background of stars. This cycle, which determines how the positions of stars shift gradually over millennia, was supposedly not understood in medieval Southeast Asia, and was thought to have been precisely calculated only by modern astronomy, using telescopes and centuries of careful observation. Manica's initial reaction was skepticism toward her own findings. Ancient temples were built according to religious symbolism and ritual requirements, not as scientific instruments. The numbers she was finding must be coincidental, products of her own pattern seeking, rather than intentional encoding by Khmer architects. But as she continued measuring and analyzing, the patterns became too numerous and too precise to dismiss as chance. The temple's proportions encoded not just 1 or 2 astronomical constants, but dozens of them, all expressed through the physical dimensions of stone structures built in the 12th century by a civilization that left no written treatises on astronomy or mathematics to explain how they achieved such precision. If Angkor Wat truly encoded advanced astronomical knowledge in its architecture, it meant the Khmer Empire possessed scientific understanding that conventional histories of science had not credited to medieval Southeast Asian civilizations. It meant that Hindu cosmology, often dismissed by modern observers as mythological rather than scientific, might have preserved genuine astronomical knowledge expressed through religious metaphor. And it meant that Angkor Wat was not merely a temple, but a 3-dimensional astronomical text, a permanent record in stone of humanity's understanding of cosmic cycles, built by architects who conceived of their structure as a model of the universe itself, with mathematical precision that would not be matched in Western architecture until centuries later. The Khmer Empire that built Angkor Wat emerged in the 9th century AD from earlier kingdoms that had controlled portions of mainland Southeast Asia, eventually dominating a territory that encompassed modern Cambodia, parts of Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. The empire's heartland was the fertile floodplain surrounding Tonle Sap, Southeast Asia's largest freshwater lake, where seasonal monsoons and the Mekong River's flood cycles created conditions ideal for intensive rice agriculture that could support dense populations and urban centers. By the 12th century, when King Suryavarman II commissioned Angkor Wat, the Khmer civilization had developed sophisticated hydraulic engineering, constructing elaborate systems of reservoirs, canals, and embankments that managed water resources, extended agricultural productivity, and allowed Angkor to become one of the world's largest pre-industrial cities, with population estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to possibly over 1 million inhabitants in the greater urban area. The Khmer were deeply influenced by Indian culture, having adopted Hinduism and later Buddhism, along with Sanskrit as the language of court and religion. But they adapted these imported traditions to create something distinctly Southeast Asian. Khmer kings ruled as Devarajas, god kings who embodied divine authority and served as intermediaries between the human and cosmic realms. This religious political system required monumental architecture that demonstrated royal power, while also serving as physical manifestations of Hindu cosmology. Temples that were not just places of worship, but symbolic representations of the universe's structure, according to sacred texts. Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, became the model for temple architecture, with towers representing the mountain's peaks and concentric galleries symbolizing the mountain ranges that surrounded it. Angkor Wat, built between approximately 1113 and 1150 AD, represented the apex of this architectural tradition. The temple was dedicated to Vishnu, the Hindu god associated with preservation and cosmic order, though it would later be converted to Buddhist use. The complex covered approximately 200 acres, making it the largest religious monument in the world, surrounded by a moat 190 meters wide that represented the cosmic ocean. The temple's architecture followed a carefully planned geometric layout. An outer wall enclosed the entire complex, within which a cruciform causeway led to the temple proper, itself consisting of 3 rectangular galleries rising progressively toward the central sanctuary. 5 towers arranged in a quincunx pattern, with 1 tower at each corner and the tallest at the center, formed the temple's iconic silhouette, representing Mount Meru's 5 peaks. Every element was positioned according to precise measurements and alignments that satisfied both aesthetic harmony and religious symbolism. The temple was built primarily from sandstone blocks, each weighing up to 1.5 tons, quarried from Phnom Kulen Mountains, approximately 40 kilometers away, and transported to the building site, probably by river and canal. The precision with which these blocks were cut and fitted, the elaborate bas-reliefs that covered gallery walls with scenes from Hindu epics, and the advanced engineering of vaulted ceilings and towers that have stood for 9 centuries, all demonstrated capabilities equal to any medieval civilization. The labor force required must have been enormous, with estimates of thousands of workers, including skilled stonemasons, sculptors, engineers, and vast numbers of laborers for transport and construction over the decades-long building period. What drove such massive investment was not mere royal vanity, but deeply held beliefs about cosmic order and the king's role in maintaining it. Hindu cosmology, as expressed in texts like the Puranas and the Mahabharata, described the universe in terms of vast cycles of time, with precise numerical relationships between different cosmic scales. The universe was conceived as mathematically ordered, with sacred numbers expressing fundamental truths about space and time. A yojana, a traditional Indian unit of distance, was understood to have cosmological significance, representing distances between different realms of existence. Time was measured in units ranging from human lifespans to kalpas, cosmic ages lasting billions of years. with intermediate cycles of yugas marking different epochs of creation and dissolution. These numbers were not arbitrary, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of large-scale patterns and cycles preserved in religious texts and transmitted through priestly lineages that maintained astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Angkor Wat were working within this cosmological framework, creating a structure that would embody divine order in physical form. But the question that would perplex modern researchers was whether they were working purely from religious texts and symbolic intentions, or whether they possessed independent astronomical knowledge that they encoded into the temple's dimensions with deliberate precision. Did they understand the actual astronomical cycles they were representing? Or were they following mythological numbers that happened by extraordinary coincidence to match cosmic measurements? The answer would depend on analysis that would not begin in earnest until centuries after the temple was built, when scholars with modern astronomical knowledge could recognize what the Khmer architects had encoded in stone. The systematic archaeological study of Angkor Wat began in earnest in the 19th century, when French colonial scholars, part of the École Française d'Extrême Orient, started documenting and restoring the temple complex. These early researchers focused primarily on art historical analysis, epigraphy, and structural preservation, approaching Angkor Wat as a masterpiece of religious architecture, but not suspecting it might encode scientific knowledge. The elaborate bas-reliefs covering the gallery walls received extensive documentation, particularly the famous churning of the ocean of milk seen from Hindu mythology, which showed gods and demons pulling on the serpent Vasuki to churn the cosmic ocean and produce the elixir of immortality. These carvings were interpreted as religious art, impressive in execution, but understood primarily for their mythological content rather than any potential mathematical or astronomical significance. Eleanor Maneker's work in the 1970s and 1980s brought quantitative rigor to analyzing the temple's dimensions and proportions. She documented not just the overall measurements, but the precise positioning of every significant architectural element, creating detailed surveys that recorded distances, heights, angles, and spatial relationships throughout the complex. What emerged from this meticulous documentation was a pattern of numbers that corresponded to astronomical and calendrical cycles with uncanny precision. The causeway from the entrance pavilion to the temple proper measured 349.203 meters, which, when divided by 4, gave 87.3 meters, matching 3 lunar months of 29.53 days each when converted using the Khmer measurement system. The temple's axial measurements, when analyzed in cubits, matched the number of days in different calendrical cycles, solar years, lunar months, and the complex relationships between them. More remarkably, Maneker discovered that the temple encoded the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle caused by Earth's axial wobble that causes the position of the equinoxes against the background stars to shift slowly over millennia. This cycle was first clearly described in Western astronomy by Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC and was later calculated with increasing precision. But it required careful observation over many generations to detect and accurate mathematical calculation to quantify. The fact that Angkor Wat's proportions encoded this cycle suggested that Khmer astronomers either possessed similar observational data and mathematical sophistication, or had inherited this knowledge from Indian astronomical traditions that preserved such information in cosmological texts. The temple's dimensions also encoded the number 432,000, which appears repeatedly in Hindu cosmology as the length of the Kali Yuga in divine years, and relates to other cosmic cycles described in the Puranas. When Maneker measured the total number of hat units in certain key dimensions of the temple, they summed to this number, or to fractions and multiples of it, suggesting the architects were deliberately working with this cosmological constant. But 432 is also significant astronomically. It is closely related to the precession rate, appears in calculations of planetary orbital periods when expressed in certain units, and connects to the solar year through various mathematical relationships. The question became whether these numbers in Hindu texts were merely mythological, or whether they preserved actual astronomical knowledge expressed through cosmological narrative. Additional patterns emerged as other researchers joined the analysis. The temple's 3 galleries could be interpreted as representing 3 cosmic realms: the earthly, the atmospheric, and the celestial. The number of steps on staircases, the number of decorative elements on various structures, and the proportions between different architectural zones all showed relationships to astronomical numbers. The bas-relief of the churning of the ocean, when measured carefully, showed the serpent Vasuki being pulled by 88 gods on one side and 92 demons on the other, totaling 180 figures, the number of degrees in a semicircle, and half the number of days in a solar year. Whether this was intentional or coincidental remained debatable, but the accumulation of such correspondences across the entire structure strained credulity to attribute them all to chance. The central hypothesis emerging from Angkor Wat's dimensional analysis posed a fundamental challenge. Did Khmer architects deliberately encode precise astronomical measurements into the structure, demonstrating scientific knowledge comparable to contemporary civilizations? Or were the numerical correspondences artifacts of religious symbolism that coincidentally aligned with cosmic cycles? This distinction mattered profoundly because it determined whether Angkor Wat represented independent scientific achievement, transmitted knowledge, or fortuitous alignment of mythological numbers with physical reality. If the astronomical encoding was intentional, it required explaining how Khmer astronomers acquired the data and mathematical tools to calculate cycles like precession with such precision. Detecting precession requires comparing stellar positions across generations, noting the spring equinox shifts westward at approximately 1 degree per 72 years. Calculating the full 25,920-year cycle accurately demands either centuries of observation or access to accumulated records. What records did Khmer astronomers possess, and how did they maintain observational continuity across generations? Indian astronomical traditions provided one possible answer. Ancient Indian texts, including the Surya Siddhanta and works by Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, contained sophisticated mathematical astronomy with accurate planetary calculations, eclipse predictions, and knowledge of precession. These texts were transmitted to Southeast Asia with Hinduism and Buddhism, giving Khmer scholars access to Sanskrit astronomical works. This would make Angkor Wat a monument to transmitted knowledge rather than original discovery, though it would still demonstrate sophisticated understanding and remarkable execution in translating abstract astronomical data into physical architecture. The alternative hypothesis held that astronomical correspondences were unintended consequences of religious symbolism rather than deliberate scientific encoding. Hindu cosmological texts specified sacred numbers and proportions for temple construction with mythological significance, regardless of astronomical accuracy. If architects followed these prescriptions faithfully, they would naturally produce structures whose measurements related to cosmic cycles without understanding the astronomy, because religious texts happen to contain numbers matching astronomical reality. This interpretation struggled with the sheer number and precision of correspondences Manika and others documented. Dozens of precise correspondences across multiple scales suggested systematic intention rather than accident. The probability that construction following purely symbolic guidelines would produce such consistent astronomical encoding seemed vanishingly small. Moreover, some encoded numbers required specific choices about measurement points and units that made sense if architects were deliberately encoding information, but would be arbitrary if they were simply following religious symbolism. The question touched on broader debates about interpreting ancient monuments showing sophisticated mathematical or astronomical properties. Pyramids at Giza, Stonehenge, and Mesoamerican structures all display alignments relating to astronomical phenomena, generating similar debates. Skeptics argued that modern researchers find patterns ancient builders never intended, seeing significance in coincidental numerical relationships. Believers countered that dismissing all correspondences as coincidental represented temporal chauvinism, assuming ancient peoples were less capable than evidence suggested. For Angkor Wat, evaluation required several criteria. Were correspondences numerous and precise enough to rule out chance? Did they require knowledge Khmer civilization could plausibly possess through observation or Indian transmission? Did other aspects of Khmer culture independently demonstrate necessary knowledge? Could encoding be explained purely through following Hindu cosmological prescriptions without understanding astronomical significance? The scholarly debate over Angkor Wat's astronomical significance divided along methodological and philosophical lines, reflecting deeper disagreements about interpreting ancient monuments and evaluating claims of advanced ancient knowledge. Supporters of intentional encoding, led by researchers like Manneke and later archaeoastronomers, argued that the density of astronomical correspondences exceeded what probability theory would allow for random chance. The architects must have understood what they were encoding and possessed the astronomical knowledge to determine which measurements would produce which correspondences. These researchers pointed to specific features seemingly designed to encode particular astronomical knowledge. The temple's east-west axis, measured in specific Khmer units, yielded numbers corresponding to epochs in Hindu cosmology, based on astronomical cycles. The number of staircase steps, dimensions of galleries and courtyards, and proportional relationships between architectural elements all showed mathematical relationships to the lunar month, solar year, and precession cycle, requiring systematic planning across the entire complex. Moreover, measurements had to be taken from specific reference points and expressed in particular units to reveal astronomical information, suggesting sophisticated encoding requiring both knowledge of what to encode and understanding of how to embed it in architecture, simultaneously serving religious and aesthetic functions. The case for intentional encoding strengthened when researchers examined Indian astronomical texts available to Khmer scholars. The Surya Siddhanta, composed before the 5th century AD and widely known throughout Hindu and Buddhist Asia, contained remarkably accurate astronomical parameters, including the solar year length calculated within seconds of modern values, the lunar month to similar precision, and explicit discussion of precession. If Khmer architects had access to this text and similar Sanskrit astronomical works, they possessed all necessary information to encode astronomical cycles into Angkor Wat's dimensions. The challenge was whether the Khmer chose to apply it architecturally, and whether Manneke's correspondences were intended by builders or projections by modern analysts. Skeptics raised substantial objections. First, they noted that with enough measurements of a complex structure and enough astronomical cycles for comparison, some correspondences would inevitably emerge by chance. The human tendency toward pattern recognition meant researchers would naturally notice correlations confirming their hypothesis, while overlooking more numerous measurements showing no astronomical significance. This selection bias could create the appearance of systematic encoding, when only a subset of measurements actually corresponded to astronomical values, with the rest ignored as architecturally determined by practical or aesthetic considerations unrelated to cosmic cycles. Second, skeptics questioned whether reported measurements were sufficiently precise and unambiguous to support strong claims about astronomical encoding. Ancient structures settle and shift over centuries. Measurements depend on exactly where reference points are chosen, and original Khmer measurement units had to be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, introducing uncertainty. When margins of error were properly accounted for, many claimed astronomical correspondences became less impressive, falling within ranges that might result from following religious prescriptions about temple proportions without requiring deliberate astronomical calculation. The debate also centered on whether Hindu cosmological numbers represented genuine astronomical knowledge or were numerologically significant without corresponding to physical reality. The number 432,000 appeared repeatedly in Hindu texts as the Kali Yuga length, measured in divine years. This number and its multiples pervaded Hindu cosmology, appearing in calculations of cosmic cycles and architectural prescriptions for temple dimensions. If Angkor Wat's dimensions encoded 432,000, this might reflect following religious prescriptions rather than astronomical calculation. That this number also related to the precession cycle could be coincidental or could reflect ancient Indian cosmological texts, preserving astronomical knowledge in mythological form, with later temple builders using these numbers symbolically without necessarily understanding their astronomical origins. The methodological dispute revealed tensions between different academic disciplines approaching the same evidence. Resolving the debate required not just more measurements, but better understanding of what Khmer architects actually knew and how they approached temple design. If texts or inscriptions explicitly discussing architectural encoding of astronomical information could be found, that would settle the question definitively. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers systematically studying other major Khmer religious structures found that Angkor Wat was not unique, but the most elaborate example of a broader tradition. The Bayon Temple at Angkor Thom, built decades later by King Jayavarman VII, showed similar, though less extensive, astronomical correspondences. The temple complex at Priyar Vihar displayed alignments with solar phenomena at specific times of year. The pattern suggested not isolated genius, but a sustained tradition of incorporating astronomical knowledge into sacred architecture across multiple generations and building projects. More significantly, researchers discovered inscriptions and texts providing context for Khmer astronomical knowledge. Sanskrit inscriptions at various temples referenced astronomical calculations for determining auspicious dedication times, demonstrating that the Khmer court employed astronomers capable of complex calculations. Detailed study of Khmer calendar systems revealed sophisticated understanding of relationships between lunar and solar cycles, with intercalation methods requiring the kind of mathematical astronomy necessary for encoding astronomical cycles in architecture. Evidence accumulated that Khmer civilization possessed an active astronomical tradition, rather than merely following religious prescriptions whose astronomical significance they did not understand. More importantly, they discovered that the Surya Siddhanta, the Indian astronomical text that Khmer scholars demonstrably possessed, contained an explicit statement of the precession rate, matching the value encoded in Angkor Wat within the precision architectural measurements could achieve. The text described precession using the traditional Indian model of trepidation, where the equinox point oscillates rather than moving continuously, but numerical parameters given in the text, when properly interpreted, yielded remarkably accurate precession rates. This discovery undermined the coincidence argument, by showing that the specific astronomical value encoded in Angkor Wat's dimensions existed in a text the architects would have accessed, and that Hindu cosmology explicitly connected to the kinds of cosmic cycles temple architecture was meant to represent. The architects were not accidentally producing astronomical correspondences through following arbitrary religious rules, but were deliberately implementing architectural expressions of astronomical knowledge their culture possessed and valued. The encoding was intentional, sophisticated, and rooted in a living tradition of mathematical astronomy that Southeast Asian civilizations had inherited from India and continued to develop. Further analysis revealed something more remarkable. The astronomical encoding was not merely decorative or symbolic, but appeared to serve practical functions. The temple's alignments allowed it to function as a massive calendar and observatory, with shadows and light patterns at different times of year, marking important ceremonial dates. Detailed study revealed that at summer and winter solstices, at specific lunar phases, and at other astronomically significant moments, the sun or moon created distinctive visual effects when viewed from particular locations within the temple. The structure was simultaneously a cosmological model, an architectural encoding of astronomical knowledge, and a functional instrument for observing and marking celestial cycles. This integration demonstrated planning and execution that elevated Angkor Wat from impressive religious architecture to genuine scientific monument. Angkor Wat stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and Cambodia's premier tourist destination, with millions of visitors marveling at its architectural grandeur and intricate bas-reliefs, without realizing they are walking through a three-dimensional cosmic map. The temple is not merely a place of worship or a symbol of royal power, but an astronomical monument, encoding knowledge of celestial cycles with extraordinary precision. The sophistication of Angkor Wat lies in its ability to fulfill multiple purposes simultaneously: religious, political, artistic, and scientific, all integrated within a unified worldview. The temple's astronomical secrets continue to be gradually decoded, reminding us that ancient monuments may contain far more knowledge than meets the eye, and that past civilizations achieved accomplishments conventional narratives have not adequately acknowledged. What mysteries do you think still remain hidden in Angkor Wat and other ancient monuments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're fascinated by the hidden scientific knowledge in ancient architecture, subscribe to our channel for more content exploring the astronomical secrets of monuments around the world.